Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the reading assignment for John Rawls. And that reading assignment begins on page 606 of the PDF. And we're looking at John Rawls in connection to and in contrast with the previous philosophers that we've been discussing in this unit, namely Hobbes's version of the social contract and John Locke's version of the social contract. John Rawls is in that same contract tradition, that same social contract tradition, but he puts a different spin on it. So I want to address some of these introductory notes here by John Chafee, the author of your textbook. John Rawls picked up the torch of the social contract theory, which had been discarded for over 200 years following Hume's withering critique. And so I just want to mention what that critique is really quickly, just to help frame the discussion on Rawls and to understand his unique approach. As David Hume pointed out, none of us ever signed up for a social contract, right? I didn't sign up for a social contract. You didn't. It's not as if on your 18th birthday you are presented, the social contract, and then you read it over and sign it and are henceforth held accountable to that social contract. No, you're held accountable to the social contract regardless of whether you signed it or not. We just sort of find ourselves existing within a society and being held accountable to those societal standards. That's what David Hume pointed out. Another thing that David Hume pointed out is that human beings have never been born outside of society, right? As long as there's been human beings, there's always been society. It's not as if you had human beings first and then society second. Human beings have always existed in groups. We have always existed in these units. And so it doesn't make any sense to talk about some pseudo-historical point back in time where humans were just existing individually in the state of nature, right? It just never happened. It's a complete fiction. And as a result of Hume's critique, philosophers pretty much abandoned the social contract theory for a couple of hundred years until John Rawls comes along in about 1972. Yes, 1972 was whenever he published his book, A Theory of Justice. But John Rawls had been doing academic research and publishing on this as early as 1958. But John Rawls comes along and he says, well, Hume was right. The social contract is a fiction, but Rawls said it's a useful fiction. And so what we want to do here is to understand in what sense is the social contract a fiction and in what sense is the social contract useful. So we've already been talking about in what sense the social contract is a fiction, right? It's a fiction because the state of nature, it never existed. There was never a time when human beings existed prior to the formation of society, because as long as there's been humans, there's been society. So to the question of in what sense is the social contract useful, even if we acknowledge it as a fiction, which it is, in what sense is it useful? Well, right here, the author of your textbook, John Chafee, addresses that. He says, rather than speculate about what social contract people actually consented to, right? Because that never happened. I didn't sign up for this, you didn't sign up for it. I didn't consent to the social contract, you didn't consent to it. So rather than think of it that way, Rawls says we can entertain the question of what type of social political state we would consent to. So notice that Hobbes and Locke treat the social contract as some historical event that happened a long time ago. And Rawls discards that completely. No. That clearly never happened. But that doesn't mean that we need to abandon the idea of a social contract altogether. We just need to reformulate it. We need to reformulate it not in historical terms, but in hypothetical terms. What contract would you be willing to sign? And that's going to help us to identify what the just society would look like. So whereas Hobbes and Locke were fundamentally interested in answering the question of what justifies governmental authority, Rawls's approach is different. His issue is different. What Rawls is interested in is the question of what would the just government look like? What would the just society look like? And to answer that question, he invites us to enter into this hypothetical. What society would we be willing to contract into? So, with that, those prefatory remarks out of the way. There's one technical piece of vocabulary here I want to address. Whereas Hobbes and Locke use the state of nature as the entry point into the social contract, John Rawls is in the same social contract tradition, but remember, he's rejecting the state of nature completely. And so the entry point to the social contract, at least Rawls's version of the social contract, is what he variously describes as either the original position or the veil of ignorance, standing behind the veil of ignorance. That's what Rawls describes as the original position. So the original position, standing behind a thick veil of ignorance, same thing. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's a technical piece of vocabulary that I just wanted to address to get out of the way here at the top. So before I get into actual textual analysis here, I want to talk about this little marginal note that I wrote there. Rawls is attempting to define justice in terms of fairness. And he defines fairness in terms of a hypothetical agreement. So let me unpack that a little bit. Rawls is, with his book, A Theory of Justice, he's clearly trying to give us a theory as to what justice is. And so Rawls says, well, we can define justice in terms of fairness. Now, that in and of itself doesn't seem all that helpful, right? Because it brings up this obvious question, well, what is fair? You're defining justice in terms of fairness, but now we have to define what fairness is. And that's where we get into the hypothetical nature of the social contract, or at least Rawls's version of it. We know something is fair if it is such that the free and rational agent, who is concerned to advance her own self-interest, would be willing to accept in that original position, standing behind that thick veil of ignorance. That's Rawls's approach. Rawls is going to be defining justice in terms of fairness, and he's defining fairness in terms of this hypothetical contract. And the hypothetical contract is what would you be willing to accept under a certain set of conditions, right? And the certain set of conditions are that you have to, that we acknowledge that you are self-interested, which is to say that you are going to want the society that is going to benefit you the most. And the second condition of that is that you don't know where you're at in society. You don't know whether you're rich or poor. You don't know your racial background, your religious affiliation, your social economic status. You don't know any of those things. You're behind that thick veil of ignorance. And then you're asked the question, well, what kind of society would you like to live in? Well, Rawls is going to say that the society that person in the original position, behind the thick veil of ignorance, who's willing to accept these provisions of a society in that condition, in that hypothetical state, well, that's going to inform us of what the just society would look like. So, Rawls here in this pink highlighted passage, he says that my aim is to present a conception of justice which generalizes and carries to a higher level of abstraction the familiar theory of the social contract as found in these philosophers. And he only mentions, of the philosophers that we've talked about, he only mentions Locke. Of course, we talked about Kant earlier, but we weren't talking about Kant's social contract theory. So as far as we're concerned, he's continuing this same condition, this same social contract tradition as Hobbes and Locke. And then he goes on to say here that the guiding ideas, that the principles of justice for the basic structure of society are the original agreement. What would you be willing to accept in that original position behind the thick veil of ignorance? So now he's going to be getting more specific here, this green highlighted passage. They are the principles that free and rational agents, concerned to further their own self-interest, right? So that's Hobbes drawing from the same page as Hobbes, where Hobbes says that, all people are just selfish. All people are just looking out for themselves. Rawls says, yes, human beings do have this tendency. Human beings are geared to look out after their own self-interest. So Hobbes is saying that the principles of justice, what constitutes justice, is you take the person who is self-interested, right? The person who wants to create a society such that it's going to help them the most. What principles of justice would that person be willing to accept from that original position? So he says that they're concerned to further their own self-interest, right? So that's drawing the selfishness from Hobbes. What would they be willing to accept in that initial position of equality? That's the original position behind the thick veil of ignorance, as defining the fundamental terms of their association. So now Rawls is going to be defining justice in terms of fairness, and defining fairness in terms of what we would be willing to accept in this hypothetical situation. So these principles are to regulate all further agreements. They specify the kinds of social cooperation that can be entered into and the forms of government that can be established. This way of regarding the principles of justice I shall call justice as fairness. So again, what is justice? A just society is the society that is fair. And what's the fair society? It's the society that we would be willing to contract into if we were in the original position. So, scrolling down here, getting more specific. The choice which rational, again, he says men, it's a dated document written in 1972. That's just the way that people wrote back then. The choice which rational people would make in this hypothetical situation of equal liberty, assuming for the present that this choice problem has a solution, that's what's going to be determining the principles of justice. So there he just goes on to talk about the original position and the principles of justice, how they were defining them behind this veil of ignorance. And this is a very important provision for Rawls's theory here. Because he's defining justice in terms of fairness, and because he's defining fairness in terms of what the free and rational agent would choose behind this thick veil of ignorance, what this is designed to do is to ameliorate this very human tendency to choose the things that are going to benefit yourself. So which is to say, if you knew in advance that you're a billionaire, and if you're asked the question, it's like, well, we're thinking about passing this, we're thinking about passing this tax, and we're going to be using the tax to fund a library where people can go and borrow books and other forms of media. Well, notice that if you're a billionaire, you're not going to want to go to a public library. You're just going to want to buy the books for yourself. You're going to want your private library with all the stuff that you want to read. And so if you're a billionaire, it's like, well, why should you have to pay money so that other people can go read a book for free, right? And so you're going to say, no, I don't want that. But notice that if you're poor, and if you know you don't have the money or the resources to fund your own personal library, well, you're going to be in favor of that. And so we're in this situation. If we go into if we're assessing whether something is fair or unfair, so if we're assessing whether something is just or unjust, and we know what our position is, we're going to be biased to vote one way or another on the basis of how it benefits ourselves, right? There's this old expression in politics: people vote their pocketbook. And what it means is that they're going to be voting for policies that aren't necessarily the best for the nation as a whole. They're going to be voting for the policies that they think are benefit themselves individually. I want what's best for me. That's how people cast a vote. So what Rawls is doing here is recognize that people have this selfish tendency, this self-interested tendency. But what if you didn't know what your bank account was? What if you didn't know whether you were below the poverty level or billionaire? Excuse me, I have the hiccups here. What if you didn't know whether you were below the poverty level or whether you were billionaire status? What would you choose then? Well, Rawls says it'd be perfectly rational to be in favor of a tax that went to fund libraries. Because if you're a billionaire, you're going to be paying a tax for books that you're not going to be reading. but guess what? You're still a billionaire, right? You're going to be just fine. Whereas if you're poor and below the poverty line, you're going to be benefiting from the existence of that public library. So you're going to be in favor of it then. And so notice that if you're in the original position, and if you don't know whether you're going to be impoverished or whether you're going to be a billionaire, well, living in a society that has a public library is going to benefit you, right? And so you're going to vote for that. And so that's what makes it just. And so you cannot define justice sort of after the fact here. You can't say, the billionaire can't say, well, this isn't fair because I'm paying for, tax dollars to go to these public institutions that I'm not benefiting from. Why should I have to pay for someone else's retirement? Why should I have to pay so somebody else can read a book for free, right? Why should I have to pay for somebody else's medical care? Well, what John Rawls is going to say is, well, you're assessing fairness in terms of how it benefits you. That's the wrong approach. You need to be assessing fairness in terms of what the free and rational agent would be willing to agree to in that position in that original position standing behind that thick veil of ignorance. So it comes up to this question of, well, now you need this life-saving surgery that you can't afford. What kind of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society that says, screw you, tough luck, you should have worked harder? Or would you prefer to live in a society that would pay for that surgery and the medical expense even if you couldn't? Well, if you're the free and rational agent, concerned to advance your own self-interest, you would want to live in a society that's going to be beneficial to you, whether you are impoverished or whether you are a billionaire. So yes, are we taxing rich people to pay for surgeries that poor people can't afford? That's absolutely what we're doing, right? No, so the question of is it fair, Rawls is going to say, well, of course it's fair. It's fair because that's what the free and rational agent would agree to when in the original position standing behind this thick veil of ignorance. So Rawls says right here, the original position is, as one might say, the appropriate initial status quo, and thus the fundamental agreement is reached in it are fair, right? He's defining justice in terms of fairness. How is he defining fairness? In terms of what people would agree to. Are we taking money from billionaires to pay for the surgeries of poor people? Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Is it fair? Yeah, it's fair, because it's what the free and rational agent would agree to in that initial position of equality. We're going to be taxing the billionaire. Guess what? The billionaire is still going to be a billionaire. They're still going to be fine, right? And the person who can't afford to pay for that surgery, they're going to be benefiting from this rule that says we're going to be paying for surgeries even for those people that can't afford them. That's exactly what makes it fair, because regardless, if you're in that original position, you don't know if you're a billionaire or if you're below the poverty line. But what you do know is that in either case, if you live in a society that is going to be paying for a surgery for the people that are most in need, well, then that's what you're going to be choosing. Let's see. So Rawls says that in this original position, standing behind this thick veil of ignorance, Rawls thinks that everyone is going to agree to two principles, possibly more, but at least these two. First, that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. So what I said in the previous video about John Locke, we're talking about his classic libertarianism. Your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. My right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins, right? That's what we mean here by basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. We don't want to have unrestricted liberty, because unrestricted liberty could adversely affect others, right? So what we want to do is maximize individual liberty to the point where it doesn't interfere with liberty for others. And notice that we have these kinds of restrictions all the time. People talk about freedom of speech. And yes, there is such a thing as free speech. I have free speech, you have free speech. But notice that just because you have free speech, that doesn't mean you can say whatever the heck you want. There are certain things you can't say. You cannot engage in libelous language. Is it libelous? I guess if it's slander. If it's in print, it's libel. If it's spoken, it's slander. But it's the same thing, right? You cannot knowingly say things that aren't true about somebody else. That's called, again, slander if it's spoken, libel if it's in print. So you have the right to speech, but it doesn't mean you can say anything you want, right? Same thing with, yelling fire in a crowded theater. You do in fact have the right to free speech, but that doesn't mean that you have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater, because by yelling fire in a crowded theater, other people could get hurt. And so if you want to wear a red hat that says, MAGA, that's free speech, right? You can do that all day. Nobody else is being harmed as a result of you wearing a Trump hat, right? If you yell fire in a crowded theater, well, now somebody's potentially going to get hurt by that. And so both instances, wearing a Trump hat, yelling fire in a crowded theater, they're both examples of free speech. But notice that only one of them is protected, right? One of them is not protected. So that's, again, just an example of what Rawls means here when he talks about the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty to others. So put yourself in the original position, behind that thick veil of ignorance, and we say, hey, how about this? How about we maximize freedom for everybody? Notice that if we rephrase that, again, if you're behind the thick veil of ignorance, what if we said, hey, how about this? Only people that own property can vote. Well, if you're in the original position, if you're behind that thick veil of ignorance, you don't know whether you're going to be a property owner or not. And why would you be willing to agree to that if you are wanting to advance your own self-interest, right? Because if you knew that you owned property, well, then you're going to say, well, yeah, that sounds like a great rule to me because it makes my voice louder, because not everybody owns property. But if I'm a property owner and I know I'm a property owner, well, then I'm going to be in favor of a rule that says only property owners can vote. But that's why Rawls is asking us to, he says that this question of what is just, it can't be from what we know about ourselves right now. We have to make those judgments about justice from that original position, behind the thick veil of ignorance. So if I'm behind the thick veil of ignorance and somebody asks, how about this? Only blue-eyed males can own property. Only blue-eyed males can vote. I'm going to say no, because I don't know if I'm a blue-eyed male, right? So what society is that person, what rule is that person going to want to accept? Well, if everybody has the right to vote, right? That's what you're going to accept. If everybody has the right to own property, that's what you're going to accept, because it's to your own best interest to accept those rules. Now, second proviso here, second principle of justice rather, that social and economic inequalities. So notice that this first one is about political liberties. What makes Rawls's theory unique is that he identifies economic rights, not just political rights. And the justification is the same, and that's what we're emphasizing here. So social and political inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage and attached to positions and offices open to all. So what Rawls means there is that differences in the distribution of social economic resources are fine as long as those differences meet these two requirements. One, everyone has to be better off as a result of the difference. And two, that everyone has the access to the aforementioned differences in gradients. So we pay engineers more than we pay janitors. So it brings up this question, it's like, well, is that fair? Well, it depends. If we pay engineers more than janitors and then say only blue-eyed males can be engineers. Well, no, that's not fair, right? But if we have a society in which everyone is free to go to engineering school, we're not keeping people, we're not disallowing people from pursuing a degree in engineering. And as long as we all benefit from that distribution, meaning that we pay engineers more than we pay janitors, and part of the deal is there that it takes a lot of time and training to become an engineer. We benefit in society from the presence of engineers, right? We need buildings, we need bridges, we need all of those things. And we as a society are better off having safe structures to live in. And so if we pay janitors the same as we paid engineers, then why would anybody want to go through all the time and the trouble and the hassle of going to engineering school if you could make just as much money as an engineer, as a janitor? We need to incentivize people to go through all the time and the trouble of completing engineering school so that we can have these bridges and buildings that we need to function as a society. So yes, it's fair that we pay engineers more than we pay janitors, because anybody can be an engineer, and we all benefit from the existence of engineers. So one thing that I want to emphasize here is this green highlighted passage. I'm not going to read all of that, but I do want to emphasize that Rawls is not an egalitarian. Oftentimes Rawls is accused of being an egalitarian. He's not. Rawls is very specific. He says that this second one here, that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably be expected to be to everyone's advantage and attached to positions and offices opened at all. Meaning that, and here's just a repeat of those principles of justice, meaning that he's perfectly fine with an inequality under a certain set of conditions. Again, if it's of reciprocal advantage, which is to say if everyone in society benefits from that unequal distribution, and as long as it's open to positions and offices to all, which is basically equality of opportunity. So yeah, we pay engineers more than we pay janitors. Is it fair? Yeah, because anybody can go to engineering school, and we're all better off as a result of having engineers in society. We pay medical physicians more than we pay philosophy professors. Is that just? Well, of course it's just, right? Because no one prevented me from going to medical school, and we all benefit as a society as a result of having physicians in it. And why would anybody go through all the time and the trouble, and also, by the way, bear the potential liability from the practice of medicine if there wasn't some financial incentive to it? So we need to give people an incentive to go through, to invest all the time and the hassle to go to medical school, because we need doctors, right? So is it fair that we pay medical physicians more than we pay philosophy professors? Of course it is, right? Nobody forced me to become a philosophy professor. I was free to pursue a degree in medicine if I wanted. I didn't choose that. I chose philosophy professor. So is that fair? Well, of course it's fair, right? I could have done otherwise. I was free to do otherwise. Nobody stopped me from going medical school. And guess what? I benefit from doctors in society, having doctors in society. So we have an inequality there, right? One person's being compensated at this level, and I'm being compensated at this level. So that's clearly a difference. Is it fair? Of course it's fair. What makes it fair? Because it's the distribution that I would have chosen in that original position, standing behind the thick veil of ignorance. Okay, I went a little bit long there, at least longer than the other videos. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to a close. I'm going to ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you again in the next video.